Today's headline is a thrilling narrative. The subheadline says, Incident in the Life of Captain Samuel Brady. This article was written by a Western man. It says, about 30 miles below the present city of Pittsburgh stood an ancient fort, known as Fort McIntosh. It was built by a revolutionary gentleman of that name in the summer of 1778. It was one of a line of forts which was intended to guard the people who lived south of the Ohio River from the incursions of the savages to the northward. This fort was one of the great favorite resorts of the great Indian spy and hunter, Captain Samuel Brady, although his usual headquarters was Pittsburgh, then consisting of a rude fort and a score or two of rough frontier tenements. Brady had emigrated westward, or rather had marched hither, in 1778 as a lieutenant in the distinguished 8th Pennsylvania Regiment under the command of General Richard Broadhead of Easton. When in the spring of 1779, McIntosh retired from command in the west, Broadhead succeeded him and remained at Pittsburgh until 1781. Shortly after his advent to the west, Brady was brevetted captain. Brady had served at the siege of Boston, fought at Long Island and White Plains, gone through the whole of the campaign at Trenton and Princeton, suffered at Valley Forge, distinguished himself at Germantown and Brandywine, and narrowly escaped death at Paoli. But his taste led him to the erratic mode of warfare known upon the frontier. Indeed, his early education upon the upper Susquehanna had inculcated and developed those tastes from the very earliest boyhood. Hating an Indian with that instinctive hatred which is begun in the bosom of the white race by long years of contest and outrage, a bitter intensity was imparted to the feeling in his case by the murder of his father and younger brother by the Indians under trying and terrible circumstances. Having promised this much by way of introduction, it brings us to that eventful morning in which Brady set out from Fort McIntosh for Pittsburgh. He had with him two of his trusty and well-tried followers. These were not attached to the regular army as he was, but were scouts and spies, who had been with him upon many an expedition. They were Thomas Tevington and Benjamin Biggs. Brady resolved to follow the northern bank of the Ohio. Biggs objected to this, upon the ground, as Brady well knew, that the woods were swarming with savages. Brady, however, had resolved to travel by the old Indian path, and having once made up his mind, no consideration could deter him from carrying out his determination. Bevington had had such implicit confidence in his ability to lead that he never thought of questioning his will. Quite a discussion arose between Biggs and his captain at the mouth of Beaver River, about a mile above the fort, and where they must cross the Ohio if they continued upon the northern side. Biggs finally waived his objections, and they crossed Beaver and proceeded with the habitual caution of woodsmen who fully understood their business. They had started early, and by traveling they had reached ere noon, the last piece of bottom land on the north side of the river, just below what is known as the Narrows. Upon this bottom, a pioneer more daring than most others had built a cabin and opened a small spot of cleared land. He had planted it in corn, and it gave promise of a most abundant harvest. But as they approached the edge of the clearing, just outside of the fence, Brady discovered Indian signs, as he called them. His companions discovered them almost as quick as he, and at once communicated to each other the necessity for a keen watch. They slowly trailed them along the fence towards the house, whose situation they well knew, until they stood upon the brow of the bluff bank which overlooked it. A sight of the most terrible description met their eyes. The cabin lay a mass of smoldering ruins, from whence a dull blue smoke arose in the clear August sunshine. They observed closely everything about. Brady knew it was customary for the Indians, after they had fired a settler's cabin, if there was no immediate danger, to retire to the wood close at hand and watch for the approach of any member of the family who might chance to be absent when they made their descent. None knowing but that they were even then lying close by, he left Bevington to watch the ruins, lying under cover, while he proceeded to the northward, and Biggs southward to make discoveries. Both were to return to Bevington if they found no Indians. If they came across the perpetrators and they were too numerous to be attacked regularly, Brady declared it to be his purpose to have Q fire at them, and that should be the signal for both of his followers to make the best of their way to the fort. All this rapidly transpired. As he stole cautiously round to the northward side of the enclosure, he heard a voice in the distance singing. He listened keenly, and soon discovered from its intonations that it was a white man's. He passed rapidly in the direction whence the sound came. As it approached, he concealed himself behind the trunk of a large tree. Presently a white man, riding a fine horse, came slowly down the path. The form was that of Albert Gray, a stalwart, brave, devil-may-care settler, who had built him a home miles away from the fort, where no one would dare to take a family except himself. Brady wore, as he almost always did, the Indian garb, and had war paint upon his face. He knew that if he showed himself upon the path, Gray would shoot, taking him to be an Indian. He therefore suffered Gray quietly to approach his lurking place. When the time came, he sprang forward, ere the settler could have time to prepare, drew his tomahawk, and seizing him, dragged him from his horse. As he did so, he whispered to him, "I am Captain Brady. For God's sake, be quiet." Gray, with the instinctive feeling of one who knew there was danger, and with that vivid presence of mind which characterizes those acquainted with frontier life, ceased at once the struggle. The horse had been startled by the sudden onslaught, and sprang to one side. Ere he had time to leap forward, Brady had caught him by the bridle. His loud snorting threatened to arouse anyone who was near. The captain soon soothed the animal into quiet. Gray now hurriedly asked Brady what the matter was. The gallant spy turned away his face as he answered him. The settler's already excited fears were thus turned into realities. The manly form shook like an aspen leaf with emotion. Tears fell as large drops of water over his bronzed face. Brady permitted the indulgence for a moment while he led the horse into a thicket close at hand and tied him. When he returned, Gray had sunk to the earth, and a great tremulous convulsion writhed over him. Brady quietly touched him and said, "Come." He at once arose, and had gone but a few yards until every trace of emotion had apparently vanished. He was no longer the bereaved husband and father. He was the sturdy, well-trained hunter, whose ear and eye were acutely alive to every sight and sound, the waving of a leaf, or the crackling of the smallest twig. He desired to proceed directly toward the house, but Brady objected to this, and they passed down toward the river bank. As they proceeded, they saw from the tracks of horses and moccasin prints upon the places where the earth was moist that the party was quite a numerous one. After thoroughly examining every corner and possible place of concealment, they passed on to the southward and came back in that direction to the spot where Bevington stood sentry. When they reached him, they found Biggs had not returned. In a few minutes he came. He reported that the trail was large and broad. The Indians had taken no pains to conceal their tracks. They simply had struck back into the country, so as to avoid coming in contact with the spies whom they supposed to be lingering along the river. The whole four now went down to the cabin and carefully examined the ruins. After a long and minute search, Brady discovered that none of the inmates had been consumed. This announcement at once dispelled the most harrowing fears of Gray. As soon as all that could be discovered had been ascertained, each one of the party proposed some course of action. One desired to go to Pittsburgh and obtain assistance. Another thought it best to return to McIntosh and get some volunteers there. Brady listened patiently to both of these propositions, but arose quickly, after taking a moment apart with Biggs, and said, "Come." Gray and Bevington obeyed at once, nor did Biggs object. Brady struck the trail and began following it in the manner for which he is so famous. It was evident that if the savages were overtaken, it could only be done by the utmost exertion. They were some hours ahead, and from the number of their horses must be nearly all mounted. Brady felt that if they were not overtaken that night, pursuit would be utterly futile. It was evident that this band had been south of the Ohio and plundered the homes of the settlers. They had pounced upon the family of Gray on their return. When the pursuit began, it must have been 2 o'clock. At least 2 hours had been consumed by the spies in making the necessary exploration about the house, ere they approached it, and in examining the ruins. Not a word was spoken upon the route by anyone. Their leader kept steadily in advance. Occasionally he would diverge from the track, but only to take it up again a mile or so in advance. The captain's intimate knowledge of the topography of the country enabled him to anticipate what points they would make. Thus he gained rapidly upon them by proceeding more nearly in a straight line towards the point at which they aimed to cross Beaver River. At last, convinced from the general direction in which the trail led that he could divine with absolute certainty the spot where they would ford that stream, he abandoned it and struck boldly across the country. The accuracy of his judgment was vindicated by the fact that from an elevated crest of a long line of hills, he saw the Indians with their victims just disappearing up a ravine on the opposite side of the Beaver. He counted them as they slowly filed away under the rays of the declining sun. There were 13 warriors, 8 of whom were mounted. Another woman besides Gray's wife were in the cavalcade, and 2 children beside his, in all 5 children. The odds seemed fearful to Biggs and Bevington, although Brady made no comments. The moment they had passed out of sight, Brady again pushed forward with unflagging energy, nor did his followers hesitate. There was not a man among them whose muscles were not tense and rigid as whipcord from hardship and exposure. Gray's whole form seemed to dilate into twice its natural size at the sight of his wife and children. Terrible was the vengeance he swore. Just as the sun set, the spies forded the stream and began to ascend the ravine. It was evident the Indians intended to camp for the night some distance up a small creek or run, which debouches into Beaver River, about 3 miles from the location of Fort McIntosh and 2 below the ravine. The spot, owing to the peninsular form of the tongue of land lying west of the Beaver, at which they expected to encamp, was full 10 miles from the fort. Here there was a famous spring, so deftly and cunningly situated in a deep dell, and so densely enclosed with thick mountain pines, that there was little danger of discovery. Even they might light a fire and could not be seen 100 yards. The proceedings of their leader, which would have been totally inexplicable to all others, were partially, if not fully, understood by his followers. At least they did not hesitate to question him. When dark came, Brady pushed forward with as much apparent certainty as he had during the day. So rapid was his progress that the Indians had just kindled their fire and cooked their meal when their mortal foe, whose presence they dreaded as much as that of the smallpox, stood upon a huge rock, looking down upon them. His party had been left a short distance in the rear, at a convenient spot, while he went forward to reconnoiter. There they remained impatiently for 3 mortal hours. They discussed in low tones the extreme disparity of the force, the propriety of going to McIntosh to get assistance, but all agreed that if Brady ordered them to attack, success was certain. However impatient they were, he returned at last. He described to them how the women and children lay within the center of a crescent formed by the savages as they slept. The guns were stacked upon the right, and most of their tomahawks. They were not more than 15 feet from them. He had crawled within 50 feet of them when the snorting of the horses, occasioned by the approach of wild beasts, had aroused a number of the savages from their light slumbers, and he had been compelled to lie quiet for more than an hour until they slept again. He then told them that he would attack them. It was impossible to use firearms. They must depend solely upon the knife and tomahawk. The knife must be placed in the left hand and the tomahawk in the right. To Biggs he assigned the duty of securing their arms. He was to begin the work of slaughter upon the right, Gray upon the left, and Bevington in the center. After each fairly understood the duty assigned him, the slow, difficult, hazardous approach began. They continued upon their feet until they had gone within 100 yards of the foe, and then lay down on their bellies and began the work of writhing themselves forward like a serpent approaching a victim. They at last approached the very verge of the line. Each man was at his post, save Biggs, who had the farthest to go. Just as he passed Brady's position, a twig cracked roughly under the weight of his body, and a huge savage, who lay within reach of Gray, immediately rose up, as if startled into this posture by the sound. After rolling his eyes, he again lay down, and all was still. Full 15 minutes passed, ere Biggs moved. Then he slowly went on. When he reached his place, a very hissing sound indicated that he was ready. Brady in turn reiterated the sound as a signal to Gray and Bevington to begin. This they did in the most deliberate manner. No nervousness was permissible then. They slowly felt for the heart of each savage that they were to stab, and then plunged the knife. The tomahawk was not to be used unless the knife proved inefficient. Nor a sound broke the stillness of the night as they cautiously felt and stabbed, unless it might be that one who was feeling would hear the stroke of the other's knife and the groan of the victim whom the other had slain. One of them had not been killed outright by the stab of Gray. He sprang to his feet, but as he arose to shout the war cry, the tomahawk finished what the knife had begun. He staggered and fell heavily forward, over one who had not yet been reached. He started up, but Brady was too quick. His knife reached his heart and the tomahawk his brain, almost at the same instant. All were slain by the free spies, except one. He started to flee, but a rifle shot by Biggs rang merrily out upon the midnight air, and closed his career. The women and children, alarmed by the contest, fled wildly to the woods. But when all had grown still, and they were called, they returned, recognizing in their frights the tones of their own people. The whole party took up their march for McIntosh at once. About sunrise next morning, the sentries of the fort were surprised to see the cavalcade of horses, men, women, and children approaching the fort. When they recognized Brady, they at once admitted him in the whole party. In the relation of the circumstances afterwards, Bevington claimed to have killed 3, and Gray 3. Thus Brady, who claimed nothing, must have slain 6, while the other 2 slew as many. The 13th Biggs shot. From that hour to this, the spring is called the Bloody Spring, and the small run is called Brady's Bend. Few, even of the most curious of the people living in the neighborhood, know aught of the circumstances which conferred these names, names which will be preserved by tradition forever. Thus ended one of the many hard fights Brady had with the savages. His history is full of daring incidents, sanguinary, close-hard contests, perilous explorations, and adventurous escapes than that of either Wetzel or Boone or Kenton. He saw more service than any of them, and his name was known as a byword of terror among the Indian tribes, from the Susquehanna to Lake Michigan. This story came from the great state of Ohio, being reported in the Democratic Press of October 13th, 1870. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.